guys, and welcome back to another edition of Kulture Kids Storytime. We have been embarking on this story around the book Heart and Soul. So this is the 5th chapter that we're going to talk about, called Reconstruction. So up until this point, we've talked about, slavery, the war that ultimately ended slavery, and now we're at the point where the slaves are free and they're thinking, what now? What do we do? This whole time we've been told what to do, when to sleep, what to eat, when to eat. We have to ask permission to leave and come and go as we please. So now what do we do now that we have the opportunity to actually experience freedom? What does that look like? So now we're going through the period of Reconstruction. So let's check out this section of the book to learn what happened next. All men are created equal, says the Great Declaration, and now a great act attests this veridity. Charles Sumner, U.S. Senator, Massachusetts. When the slaves were set free, they didn't have nothing, and the old masters didn't give them nothing. All of those folks had a mighty hard time. They had to start from scratch. In slavery time, it was against the law for most blacks to own property, to vote, or to read. All of a sudden, we had to find a way to make it on our own. A few politicians had the bright idea that black people should be sent back to Africa. All 4 million of us. President Lincoln even seriously considered the idea before the end of the war. Even though some black folks made the trip, there was no way the government would pay to send all of those people back across the ocean. Besides, we didn't know Africa any more than we knew the south of France. We were born and raised in America, and we were Americans by right. And America is where we should stay. Southern white folks had to start over too. Much of the South was destroyed by the war. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta were burned, abandoned, and looted by the soldiers. The great wealth of the South, the proud South, was gone. Deserted Southern properties were given away, and the Confederate dollar wasn't worth a cup of red Georgia clay. Young folks used to dig that money out of the garbage and play with it. To help Southerners and freed slaves get on their feet, the government planned to rebuild the South with a series of acts called Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, which oversaw Reconstruction efforts, gave a few former slaves each about 40 acres of deserted land to cultivate and live on. Problem was, no one told the freedmen that the land was already owned by someone else. When the true owners of the land came back after the war, President Johnson ordered the freed slaves to give the land back. Some black folks moved west to claim land and start over, or up north to work in cities. Most stayed and, like Pap, went to work for their old masters as sharecroppers. Sharecropping was an arrangement where workers would split the profit of a crop with the owner of the land. Old master paid for the seed, supplies, equipment, and living expenses and told Pap he had to pay him back for his share of the expenses at the end of the year. After Pap settled his debt to the owner, he'd get the rest of the money owed to him from the crop. It sounded like a fair deal, but old master was a crook. When he and Pap settled at the end of the year, he always found a way not to pay Pap. He subtracted the cost of the seed, food, housing, and such from what he owed, Pap padding it here and there, figuring until it ended up with Pap owing him. Even if he wanted to, Pap couldn't say a word. The unwritten but well understood rule was never contradict a white person, no matter what. That was reason enough to find yourself strung up from a tree. The best Pap could do was to try to make it back the next year, but he never did, honey. Sharecropping was a sneaky way of keeping black folks in the fields without having to pay them. Wasn't much different from slavery. With the end of slavery, millions of former slaves finally had the right to learn to read, write, and figure. The Freedmen's Bureau helped to set up and oversee free public schools and colleges all around the South. Scores of northern teachers flooded down to teach all the newly freed slaves and poor white folks who weren't able to go to school before the war. Black men also gained the right to vote, and with that, put some of their own folk in office, even sent a few to the White House, to the House of Representatives. These were very big steps, but our progress didn't come without a price. The time after the war was terrible for Black folks. Even though we could vote and go to school, most of us were very poor and illiterate. Union soldiers occupied southern towns to keep the peace, but didn't do much to protect Black people from the new groups of mean whites like the Ku Klux Klan, who threatened us all year long. To stop Black folks from voting, Klansmen marched in the front of their homes wearing white sheets over their heads, shooting out the windows and burning homes to the ground, or worse, dragging Black folks out of their homes to lynch them. The law didn't do a thing to stop it. Shoot, some of the men wearing the sheets were lawmen. It was their way of keeping us in our place, wherever that was supposed to be. They couldn't stand to see us trying to be equal to whites. They were convinced that they were somehow superior to Black people. My grandmother used to call it the sickness. Whatever it was just plain mean, honey. Lord knows how those folks could fix it in their minds to do the things that they did to us back then. It's a miracle we made it through. After a while, the government seemed to just give up on Reconstruction. Federal troops were sent back home and state governments wrote new laws called Jim Crow laws that divided everything by race. Restaurants, libraries, theaters, schools, markets, drinking fountains, you name it. There were now two Americas, one white and one Black, and the South slowly fell backward into something that looked a lot more like slavery. Sharecroppers were stuck in the fields in debt to landowners. Black people lived in fear of violence, and the vote was pushed out of reach with poll taxes, which people had to pay in order to vote, and which were too high for most Black folks. New laws like the Grandfather Clause said only people whose grandfathers who had voted in prior elections could vote, which obviously made it impossible for Black folks to vote. The North had won the Civil War, but the South, it won Reconstruction. So this goes to tell you, even though our people were freed, that didn't even start to address the hurdles that we had to climb. So now you have a group of people, they don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, and they're constantly being manipulated by white landowners who are changing the laws constantly to benefit themselves. So that always gave them an unfair advantage over these poor Black individuals who didn't have access to the education that the wealthy white landowners had. So that was one challenge. Another challenge was the sharecropping practice, which was incredibly unfair. So they're basically preying on these people that are illiterate and don't have the knowledge that they have, and they're constantly lying. So they're telling them that they're constantly owing them a debt, which means that they have to come back year after year after year after year to try to work off that debt. But the truth is they never would. The system was set up so that those people would never, ever pay off that debt, so that they would continue to work for free for these landowners under a different name. Sharecropping was just another name for slavery. Slavery is just another term where you're working for free and you're being told what to do. Sharecropping really wasn't too much different. It was basically the same thing because they really had no say in how they were treated, their hours, none of that. They were in debt to these landowners and they were forced to do what they were told. So this is another dark part of history where we're trying to get ahead, we're trying to make change, we're trying to strive for the better, but we're constantly being beaten down with these unfair laws and given disadvantages just based on the color of our skin. So thanks again for tuning in for this week's edition of Kulture Kids Storytime, and I hope that you'll join us next week for Chapter 6 when we talk about cowboys and Indians, Native Americans, and westward Negroes. Hope to see you next time. Have a good one, guys.